Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV. I know from the sidebar you've all enjoyed submarines. Well, we've got three kind of random shows to finish off this week. Tomorrow we're talking about military suicides, which probably won't be a very popular show, but is very important. That's Mark Turner. He's been on before. Friday we've got Dilip Amin coming on talking about the early warning system radar and Observer Corps in Battle of Britain in England. But today I'm joined by David Chrisinger, author of The Soldier's Truth, Ernie Pyle, and the Story of World War II. David is heavily involved in all sorts of writing workshops in Chicago, and we welcome here to talk to you about Ernie Pyle. Who hasn't heard of Ernie Pyle? So I'll bring David in now. Good afternoon, sir. How are you today?
I'm doing well. Thank you for having me.
Well, we've had some people discuss some legends on this show. We've had discussions about MacArthur and Patton, and Ernie Pyle's got to be up there in, one of the top 10 most famous Americans of World War II. And yet, as we will talk about, never actually making any decisions. He's not one of these people who's involved in deciding the outcome of the war. Right. He is just there telling it like it was as he saw it for the folks back home and reached this legendary status. So we'll ask a little bit about your writer's workshop in a minute, but as a writer, how influential is Ernie Pyle still, 80 years on from his peak?
That's the profession reflects what Ernie Pyle did. I mean, the idea of being a correspondent, embedding yourself on the front lines for weeks at a time, reporting the human, on the human toll of the war, like that's standard now, right? I mean, yeah. Go to Israel, go to Ukraine. You can't cover those conflicts without someone doing that kind of work. Ernie Pyle started that. I mean, that was his style. That was his way of finding these stories. So that's one thing, is that he changed the way people did the work. The second thing I would say, the kind of lasting impact for me is how clearly and concisely and compellingly he can tell these really, really complicated stories. And, I think the best way to think about Ernie's trajectory, his career trajectory, is to think of him being a war correspondent as kind of the final act in a very long story. So he started in journalism in the 20s, and he became a copywriter. He was especially good at writing headlines and writing summaries. So he was really good at getting things down to their, bare essentials and their essence. After he'd done that for many years, he became an aviation correspondent in the early days of aviation in the United States. And he was getting to know all the pilots and getting to, write these stories about harrowing trips that they had taken and, all the rest. Well, fast forward to World War II, suddenly, those pilots are now in the Air Corps, and they're getting ready to fly, over France and Belgium and Germany. And he's already got connections there, and he's already got friendships built up, and he already understands a lot of that material. So that's kind of the second wave of his career. And then the third wave was when he became a roving correspondent during the Depression in the United States. And he actually crisscrossed the country 35 times. He visited every state in the Union. He also traveled around Central and South America. So he got to know people all over the country. He got to know landscapes and different cultures and different ways of understanding the world. And so by the time he decides to become a war correspondent, he knows how to write clearly and concisely on deadline. He knows a lot about aviation and about telling stories that grab people's attention. He knows how to do human interest pieces. He knows how to talk to people, to listen, to observe, to find those stories that have been overlooked by other people. So it really is like World War II is like the culmination of all these different skill sets for him, to where he's able to start reporting on the war in a way that nobody else was doing. He was doing that work just as a war correspondent instead of as a, peacetime correspondent. And those were the stories that people were really hungry for. And he told them in ways that made them very accessible. He wasn't really concerned about, getting the most up-to-date news or breaking any headlines. He wasn't concerned about investigating.
He wasn't after the scoop, was he?
He wasn't after the scoop.
Telling the truth, yeah.
Exactly. He was an observer. He was a participant to a certain extent. And he would like to joke that all he really did was write the soldiers' letters home. That's all he did. He talked about the food. He talked about the sleeping conditions. He talked about what it was like to be away from home, what it was like to, sleep in a slit trench, what it was like to be on a convoy moving through the mountains in the middle of the night. I mean, all those really, those experiences that soldiers may not have the vocabulary or the literary skill to always communicate in the way that Ernie could. Well, he could do it, and he could paint pictures for people so that they could really understand, or at least better understand, what their sons and their husbands and their fathers and whoever else was experiencing overseas. And so now, my job, I wear a couple of different hats, but my main job is I lead the University of Chicago's public policy school. So I teach students how to write clearly, concisely, compellingly about.
Give them a copy of Ernie Pyle, go home early, easy.
Exactly, right? Assign Ernie Pyle, go home early. But my students are trying to learn how to write about war, how to write about famine, how to write about crisis, how to write about the terrible problems that we're facing in this world. And there's plenty to learn from Ernie. I do use him as an example quite a bit. And then another thing that I do is I lead writing seminars for a nonprofit newsroom called the War Horse, where I teach storytelling skills to military veterans and their families. And so we've done a number of week-long seminars over the years. They're all expenses paid. We fly people in. They get to spend a week with me and other mentors, getting help writing their stories. And then we publish those stories on the War Horse website. And actually, the War Horse has its name. The name comes from Ernie Pyle, which was sort of a serendipitous thing that happened along the way with my journey. When I met the founder of the War Horse, he told me about the mission of the organization, and he wanted me to help out by teaching seminars. And I said, I'm all in, but you got to tell me, what's the War Horse? What is that about? Because, there was this movie called The War Horse that was about horses in World War I. And I said, I don't see any horses on the website. Is there something I'm missing? And he said, well, it comes from Ernie Pyle. Because when Ernie came home from France in the fall of 1944, he hadn't quite decided yet whether he was going to cover the war in the Pacific yet. And he wrote a column trying to explain why he was coming home from the war after Paris was liberated. And he said, who knows, maybe once I get back home to New Mexico and I have a few weeks to rest, maybe I'll go war horsing across the Pacific. And the little bit of research that I did in the origins of that term, to warhorse to be a warhorse was that you were old, you were seasoned, you had been through the ringer, and you were going to do one more campaign. And honestly, I feel like that really sums up Ernie's story of World War II, was that he, by the time he left France, he'd been in the front lines for a year. He'd been overseas for, I think it was 26 months. He had almost died, a dozen times, and he was finally ready to come home. And then conditions at home were not any less stressful. He had issues with his wife, with their relationship, with her mental health. His fame at that point was so overwhelming. He was constantly being hounded. It was actually easier for him to go back to war, I think, than to deal with all the things at home. And that was his last campaign. He ended up being killed at the end of the war during the Battle of Okinawa. And so that term, the War Horse, is really kind of fitting for Ernie. So I teach storytelling and writing, like I said, to military veterans and their families. And then, I've been a fan, a pretty, intense fan of Ernie Pyle since I first learned about him, which I'm embarrassed to say it was not until 2016 that I really got to know Ernie Pyle. And how I first got to know him was I was on the island of Okinawa. I was doing research for a different writing project that had to do with my grandfather's service. He was a tank driver during that battle. And there is a memorial on the southern end of the island that drew some inspiration from the Vietnam War Memorial in Washington, D.C. It's these very big black granite slabs. And on the slabs, they have all the names of all the people who lost their lives during the Battle of Okinawa. There were 260,000 names inscribed on those walls, because that's the Japanese defenders, the Okinawan civilians, the allies. And I went to this memorial with a local tour guide, and he said, we can make an etching of one of the names of someone your grandfather lost. Do you know any of those names? And I didn't have that sort of granular level detail at that point. So I probably looked like, a little embarrassed. And he said, don't worry, I'll take you to a name that you'll recognize. And he took me over and he showed me Ernest Taylor Pyle inscribed on that stone. And I didn't make the connection initially. And he said, wait a minute, you flew 7,000 miles to try to better understand what your grandfather experienced during World War II, what soldiers experienced during World War II, and you haven't read Ernie Pyle cover to cover yet. So he gave me a homework assignment. He said, as soon as you get home, read Brave Men, read everything that Ernie's written. I did that. I fell in love with the writing. That was early. That would have been sort of summer of 2016. Started doing lots of research about Ernie. I was teaching some of his writing in my workshops and some of my classes. And then I started working as a columnist for the New York Times for a column called the At War column. And in 2018, the editor put out this call that they were looking for stories that could run for the 75th anniversary of big milestones towards the end of the war, towards the end of World War II. So when I got that notice, I said, has anyone picked D-Day yet? And the editor said, nope, nobody's claimed D-Day. And I said, I want D-Day, and I want to write a piece about the coverage that Ernie did after the Normandy invasion. The editor said, oh yeah, I remember reading about Ernie Pyle in journalism school. Yeah, let's do that. What's your idea? And I said, well, can you send me to Normandy? Yeah. And the editor said, well, we can't send you to Normandy, but we can send you to Dana, Indiana, which is Ernie Pyle's hometown.
Okay, yeah.
And there is a wonderful museum there, fantastic museum that was dedicated to Ernie. And so I got to meet, all these people on the board that runs the museum, and these people that have, really kind of dedicated their lives to ensuring that Ernie's legacy lives on. And again, just totally blown away by how much impact he had on people, the ways in which his writing still resonates with people after all these years. So I ended up writing an article about Ernie's coverage of D-Day, which is, and we can talk about it if you like. It's incredibly, I think, poetic in how it communicated really difficult truths about what had happened during D-Day, but in a way that didn't lead to fatalistic thinking or didn't lead to defeatist thinking. It was a difficult truth that Ernie Pyle was able to tell because he had earned the trust of his readership for many years. And so that's what the piece was about. And the day after it came out, I was told that the article had 1 million views in the first several hours that it had been on the website. And that this was like totally blew everybody, away, very surprising. My agent, in fact, was a little bit nervous that no one would remember Ernie Pyle, and that turned out to be a worry that was really unfounded. And so the paper decided to run the piece in the actual paper a few days later. And a few days after that, I got an email from an editor who said, I read your Ernie Pyle article. I read the piece you wrote about your grandfather. I read a few other things that you wrote. If you ever want to write a book about Ernie Pyle, let me know, because I would love to publish a book about Ernie Pyle. And I can tell you, as an author who's struggled many years to find publishers, that's not how it normally works.
No, not normally. Yeah.
Normally you toil and toil and toil until someone, magically sees the brilliance in whatever it is that you're trying to do. Well, I think it was I think I wrote a good article, but I really think it was Ernie's story that really connected with people. And it was a story of, a very unlikely man becoming basically the voice of the soldier in Europe. and becoming the translator, and becoming wildly famous because he was so good at what he was doing. So just to put things in perspective a little bit, at the time, at D-Day, he had about 12.5 million daily readers. So he wrote a column 6 days a week. 12.5 million people every day were reading his column. There are writers today that would give their left arm for those kind of numbers. And that was at a time when the United States was half as big as it is now. Literacy rates were lower. There were a lot more newspapers, so that helped. But I mean, he was a celebrity journalist before there were celebrity journalists. Hollywood was making a movie about him. His books were New York Times bestsellers for months and months. He was getting offers to speak all the time, getting offers to write all the time. It was very overwhelming for him. And so when I talked to the editor about the book idea, I said, I went to Okinawa and I retraced my grandfather's steps through the battle, and I think I'd like to do that with Ernie Pyle. That's what I want. I want to go to North Africa and Sicily and Italy and France, and I want to go back to the Pacific, and I want to go to all these places where Ernie went, because I wanted to see what was the lasting impact of the war in these places. How is it remembered? How is Ernie remembered, if at all? And also, what did Ernie get right, and what did maybe he get wrong? What did he not know that we know now, that might have changed the way that he did his reporting, or might have proved his reporting was the best reporting at that time based on again what we know now after all these years. And the editor was really excited about that idea. He said, let's do it, write up a proposal. And I got to basically, travel the world for a few months until COVID hit. Got to travel the world and look for all these places that Ernie wrote about, and had some really interesting adventures along the way. Then once, the pandemic sort of simmered down enough that we could travel internationally again, I got to finish the travel, and the book came out in May. And I just found out 2 days ago that an organization called the Book List ranked it as one of the top books of 2023. So that was really exciting.
Good going. Yeah, Ernie would be pleased.
Ernie would be pleased. I'd like to think so. Yeah.
So I mean, it's an amazing introduction to the book, and I've just got one of my Ernie Pyle books, and it's a tatty old. It's all browned pages, and this is Here Is Your War, and this is on its 7th printing in April 45 alone. So that's the level of fame you had. That there were first printing, second printing, third printing in April, fourth printing in April, then 2 more printings in May in the same year for one book.
Yep. Oh, he sold hundreds of thousands of copies. Yeah.
It was
pretty wild.
And we'll talk about him as a person, and we'll do questions and things later on. And as a Normandy guide, I said to you before going live, I would read his piece about walking along Omaha Beach, because so many journalists were there for D-Day, of course, and often they're writing about the scale. It's the 7,000 ships. It's the ships as far as the eye can see. The number of aircraft in the skies, and then there's this sense of it the beginning of a step towards the defeat of Germany. And myself, with Ernie Pyle's writing, it was more about the mundane. It was more about, for those who know that piece, is walking on the shoreline and finding the unwritten into V-mails and the tennis racket and the Bible and I picked up a Bible and a hand grenade. That wonderful line he uses there. And then ending on the fact that the bodies are being washed out to sea and coming in again uncovered. He wasn't talking about the final victory. He wasn't talking about the scale. He was bringing it right down to the personal suffering of individuals. And I think that must have, when that was, okay, as you say, he had a huge fame. But that was, I'm sure, not how other journalists were writing about it there at the time.
No.
I mean, I'm thinking about some of the British journalists who are riding in the gliders. It's all about the being part of the armada, being part of something enormous.
Right. Yeah, that's a great way to distinguish between what Ernie was trying to do with his column and what other folks were trying to do. And in fact, it's even more interesting, I think, when you realize that Ernie actually missed the initial landing. Yeah. So he didn't land until the next day. And it was through no fault of his own. He was slated to land on D-Day, but the ship he was in had some engine troubles, and it kind of drifted out of the convoy. And then by the time they got the engine fixed and they returned to the convoy, they had missed their spot, and it was a whole thing. So when he landed the next day, he had kind of missed everything, right?
Yeah.
The fighting was, several miles inland. And I think of that as like that moment where he feels like he missed the biggest story of the century. He's not going to be able to write it in the same way that the ones who were there are going to be able to write it. So what does he do? He goes down along the beach and he just walks along the sand and he records all the things that he sees. And there's those really personal artifacts, right? The Bible, the letters that hadn't been sent, the cigarettes, the combs, the shaving kits, all the things that soldiers carry that we don't necessarily think about as gear or as, military issue. He was highlighting all those things. And I remember when I read that the first time, I thought, oh, this is what it cost, right? This is what D-Day cost. In a way that's so much different than when you lay out what were the casualties, how many ships, how many planes, like you said. And Ernie thought that was him sort of doing the best he could with the fact that he hadn't been there on the day. But when that story came out a week or 10 days later, when it came out in the United States, it took the whole country by storm. It was read into the Federal Registry a couple of times. It was used in national war bond campaigns. It was printed in hundreds of newspapers. I mean, it was everywhere. And he was always sort of self-deprecating and never really felt like his stuff was any good, and always acted surprised when people really responded to it. And that was true for his D-Day stories as well, that he just didn't understand why everyone got so excited about them. But I think it was because he was able to really bring the war into a view that people could understand.
Well, that's it.
Yeah.
A journalist in war trying to explain to people who don't understand war the operational level, as historian James Holland would say, it's an impossible task, because people sitting in a farm in Oklahoma have no idea about how wars are won by divisionals and artillery works. What they do understand is loneliness and
Yes.
being cold or being hungry or missing your friends, or and that's, as we talked about on the Bill Mauldin show, with the cartoon Willie and Joe, that explaining that being wet is being wet. You can be wet hiking a mountain in Scotland, or you can be wet fighting in the Battle of Italy in the winter of 44-45. But that ability to convey something that the readers will actually understand, that's the skill he had. And yet, as we said, perhaps he didn't even know he had that skill. But let's because you've prepared some stuff to talk about. We're going to have this conversation about, and we'll go back and around and circle around the houses. But let's talk about Ernie Pyle himself. We've talked a little bit about how the book came about and who you are. So let's talk a bit more about Ernie.
Yeah. Well, I have a brief section I wanted to read, because I've gotten this question a lot, and I imagine there are folks out there who have this question, which is, well, why did he keep going back?
Right.
Why, if he was so good and he was so treasured and so loved, and he had put in he had done his duty, why wasn't it enough? Why did he keep going back? And for me, the answer, or at least part of the answer, came from this one experience that he had during the Battle of Sicily. And so I've got a couple pages here I'd like to read just to tell you about that experience. So here we go. The empty bottle of blood plasma hung next to the dying man's body. A mustachioed young doctor with a stethoscope around his neck circulated among the wounded men stranded on nearby litters. There were no field nurses in the small tent hospital hidden in an olive grove back behind the front lines. In the silence between the man's dying breaths, Ernie swallowed hard. He could do nothing. When he first saw the dying man being brought into the tent, Ernie was recuperating among wounded soldiers with what the doctor had called battlefield fever. A man with this ailment aches all over and has a high temperature, Ernie reported. The doctors thought it was caused by a combination of too much dust, bad eating, not enough sleep, exhaustion, and the unconscious nerve tension that comes to everybody in a frontline area. A man doesn't die of battlefield fever, Ernie reassured his readers, but he thinks he's going to. To treat his fever, the doctor gave Ernie soup and tomato juice to rehydrate him, a cot for him to rest, an opioid-based solution to plug up his insides, an aspirin and some codeine, and for good measure, a little morphine. The surgeons believed in using lots of morphine, Ernie wrote. It spares a man so much pain and consequently relieves the general shock to his system. The only thing I can say on behalf of my treatment, he continued, is that I became well and hearty again. Others, of course, were not so lucky, including the dying man with the gauze over his face, whom the orderlies had placed on the earthen ground in the middle of the main aisle. The same day they set the dying man down, the chaplain ran in to issue him his last rites. The dying man's name was John. John, I'm going to say a prayer for you, the chaplain whispered into the man's ear. The chaplain was kneeling. He made the sign of the cross and held John's hand as he recited the act of contrition. My God, I am heartily sorry for having offended thee, and I detest all my sins because I dread the loss of heaven and the pains of hell, but most of all because they offend thee, my God, who art all good and deserving of all my love. John gasped for breath through the thin gauze covering his face as he tried in vain to repeat the prayers. When the chaplain had finished his last refrain, he told John he was doing fine. A moment later, the chaplain rose to his feet and walked out of the tent. There were other dying men who needed him. With the tent flaps opened, a steady breeze brushed against the men in their bloody uniforms. As John's last breath passed from his lips, Ernie, watching him, felt a rush of hot blood flow from his stomach down through his laden limbs. His breath came so heavy he could feel it in his ears. A sort of helplessness wrapped in anger welled up deep inside him, driving him close to tears. Of course, it couldn't be otherwise, Ernie later told his readers. But the aloneness of that man as he went through the last few minutes of his life was what tormented me. I felt like going over and at least holding his hand while he died, but it would have been out of order, and I didn't do it. I wish now I had. So that was a moment in Ernie's story in Sicily where I think that was part of his transition away from being an observer, being a correspondent, being someone who was kind of a fly on the wall, to being a participant, to being in it and feeling emotionally connected in a way that he hadn't up until that point. And, we were talking before we started rolling about, there are really only two ways to do that kind of work as a war correspondent. One is to show up and be detached and objective and neutral and not let yourself feel or empathize as much as you can compartmentalize. That's the goal. And then there's the way that Ernie started to report, which is where he started to identify with the people he was writing. He was empathizing with them. He was trying to understand them in a really personal way. And he was able to do that because he didn't believe there was an objective way to write about war. He thought it was a very subjective experience, and he wanted to communicate that. I think that was part of what made him such a special writer, was that he really felt all the things that he was writing.
Well, I mean, we talked about it before going online, and we've talked about it in other shows about correspondence. As you said there, you've either got to remain detached or you've got to just go in and accept the fact that you're not being totally objective. And one of my best friends, Warwick, who's an Australian, he works in Hollywood now as a still photographer. He was a correspondent or a photographer, war photographer out in Afghanistan, Jordan, you name it. He was there, and it tore him up. You're there, you've got to try and take photos, but there's a child that's been blown up. Do you go and assist? Do you catch a photo of someone else assisting, or do you assist? But if you assist yourself, you don't get the photo, and then you're participating. It's a complicated set of rules. And the other thing which we absolutely need to address sort of right away is he completely understands mental health and the frailties of mental health, because his wife was struggling and he was struggling. So explain a little bit about his own personal demons and that of his beloved.
Sure. So Ernie, I'd say it was safe it'd be safe to call him, sort of a depressive man. He struggled with melancholy. He had depressive episodes throughout his life, but he was always able to kind of, get himself through it. Usually he thought it was a result of burnout or of just, doing too much. That was kind of how he wrote about battlefield fever too, is that it was exhaustion. It was just being totally overwhelmed. But his wife, Geraldine, everyone called her Jerry. She suffered from what a couple of doctors told me was probably bipolar disorder. And it started to get worse and worse the older she got, where her highs were very high, her lows were very low. She attempted suicide several times before World War II even began. She was hospitalized several times. At one point, the doctor that Ernie had got to treat her had suggested that they divorce so that that would shock Jerry out of her depression. I mean, that just goes to show like how little they really understood what was happening. This is before a diagnosis, before medication. And they tried the electromagnetic therapy. They tried prescribing opioids to her. They prescribed her to drink alcohol, barbiturates. I mean, they were really kind of throwing spaghetti at the wall and trying to see what stuck. But one thing that was true was that every time Ernie would leave, Jerry would get worse. And so when he would come home, she would be a little bit better. And then as it was time for him to leave again, that was when her episodes would get pretty bad. The last time that Ernie came home from France was also the last time that Jerry attempted suicide and was as close as she ever came to completing it, but luckily didn't, and was institutionalized and was told by the doctor that Ernie wouldn't be able to speak to her for months at a time because she had to really do a lot of work to kind of again, they didn't really understand what she was going through. So there was always the kind of internal melancholy that he was dealing with. He used alcohol quite a bit to deal with that. That certainly didn't help things as the war progressed. But he also had a wife who was home and was ill and needed constant care and needed nursing care around the clock or needed to be institutionalized. And he's going through his own traumatic experiences, like I said, he spent about a year living on the front lines out of the 26 months or so that he was overseas. So he, was nearly blown up several times. He was nearly shot by snipers several times. He went through a lot of pretty harrowing situations. And all of those things, eventually caught up with him. When the liberation of Paris happened, he was very jubilant, just like everybody else. But then there was a retaliatory raid that the Germans made the night after the liberation, and it killed a few hundred people. And that sort of snapped Ernie back to the reality that the war was not over, that more people were still going to be killed, that the Germans weren't ready to surrender. And he had just sort of had enough, couldn't do it anymore. And he wrote a really telling column from France where he really laid all that out for the readers and just said, I've been doing this for so long. I've been through so much. I feel like I'm not able to write clearly anymore. My mind is all jumbled up. I can't sleep. I'm struggling with, all these different things. He was very vulnerable, right? We would call that very vulnerable today. He was putting it out there. I think when we look back, we tend to assume that everyone had this very macho, greatest generation kind of attitude. And it was a lot more complicated than that. I think Ernie showed a lot of strength, frankly, by being able to detail some of the things that he was going through. But it was quite a balancing act for him to be able to do that work, to have his wife as ill as she was, to kind of be dealing with his own things at the same time. Certainly wasn't. And then consider, right, that he's writing 6 columns a week for millions of people. It's really astounding.
And it's the classic split in the conflict he was obviously having is, does he stay at home with Jerry and try and make her life better? And yet he's got a commitment now to explaining the war to the American public, which is something that most servicemen were dealing with. So many servicemen were married and had kids, or people who had to, in Britain, had to let their children go off as evacuees somewhere else. So you're sacrificing your connection with your children for their safety. He completely gets that. He completely understands the conflict between your personal interests and your greater responsibilities as a human being on the planet. And the fact, as you say, that he's opening up about this. He's not just bottling it all away. And we've done so many shows this channel about Montgomery and Patton and MacArthur, who don't really show much of their own feelings to the public. The person they put on show at the the briefings is a show person. It's a character. It's a carefully constructed presentation they want to give to the world. And sometimes in their diaries and their personal correspondence, they'd reveal a little bit more. I mean, the FDR would be the classic as well. Really, the FDR that would speak in front of the public is a very different FDR to the guy who was dealing with polio and all the things he dealt with at home. So, Ernie Pyle was a trendsetter in terms of how you were an embedded correspondent before there was such a thing, but also, as you said there, opening up about the issues he's dealing with.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And he had to also deal with military censorship, so there was there were certain things that he wasn't able to write about. A couple of times that I found evidence of him kind of running afoul with the censors were when he did try to write about mental health issues. So there were a couple times he tried to write about soldiers that had been basically shell shocked and were not able to continue in their military occupation, whatever that was. And the censors cut that out. They thought that would be that would sort of give comfort to the enemy, or it would make the reader think that the American soldier wasn't tough enough. And I don't have any evidence to prove this, but it's my speculation, my intuition, that when Ernie found out that he couldn't write about other people struggling with those things, that he then decided he was going to write about himself. And maybe there was some sort of leniency that he received there from the censors, that he wasn't trying to paint a picture of this is what all the soldiers are going through. He said, this is what I'm going through. But then I think, an astute reader could read that and say, well, if Ernie's feeling that way, I wonder if other people are feeling that way too, And there are columns where he writes where he says, it's going to take us a long time when we get home before we're okay again. It's going to take us a long time before we unlearn all the things that we had to learn in order to survive. And I can't think of a better definition of post-traumatic stress than, the normal ways in which people adapt to abnormal situations. Right? They adapt normally to abnormal situations. That's post-traumatic stress. Well, then you come home and you're not in that abnormal situation anymore, but your body thinks you are, right? Your body feels like that car backfiring is a sniper round, or that crowd is dangerous because bad things happen when people crowd together, or, whatever it is. These are things that, troops coming home from Iraq and Afghanistan and other places in recent years would totally recognize in reading some of the things that Ernie was reporting on. So maybe there's a way to, he was kind of subversive almost in that way, that he, when he would run up against a barrier to telling some kind of truth, he would figure out a way to get around it. And that's something I really admire about him as well.
Well, I think, he would maybe say he was streetwise. I mean,
that's a good way to put it.
There's a big connection. There's a difference between him and Bill Mauldin. Bill was like 22 or something when he was doing these cartoons. He was, he hardly even shaving, Bill. But but Ernie Pyle, as you said there, this 30-year instant fame he had, the classic, an overnight success after 25, 30 years of hard work and toil. So he'd been around the block. He'd been round the USA when the USA was at its worst during the Depression, and seeing how people, find solutions to problems.
Yes,
so
exactly.
I think he, as you explained there, he knew how far he could push things. He knew how to highlight things without going in obvious. And I think we'll do some questions from viewers now, because one of the things that happened with Bill Mauldin, of course, is he did have run-ins, most famously with General Patton, who kind of
Yes.
pulled him in and said. So Jeff is saying, did Patton have issues with Ernie Pyle, or did any other generals or figures have issues with him, or did he just manage to keep just close enough to the line to not really piss anybody off?
Well, it's actually the contrary. The generals loved Ernie because, and actually General Bradley wrote that his troops performed better when Ernie was with them. And so he wanted to duplicate Ernie and have as many Ernies as he could have, because soldiers would fight harder knowing that Ernie was there, because maybe he would write about them, or he would write about their unit or their division. Ernie liked to say that he didn't like officers. He preferred enlisted men, but he had lots of friends who were officers, and lots of acquaintances and people that he was close with. So it's not, he wasn't the, anti-officer that maybe like, a Joe Heller or like a Kurt Vonnegut, might have been. But he also didn't care very much for General Patton. That was something that he wrote about privately with his editor. And the reason was because Patton had slapped his 2 soldiers in Sicily. And Ernie really felt like that was the opposite of what a good general should do, that a good general takes care of his troops, doesn't slap them around and embarrass them. Now, how did Ernie deal with that? Well, again, I don't have any evidence that says, here's how I'm going to stick it to Patton. But what he did do was he never wrote about George S. Patton. There's not one column that Ernie writes about him. And you know how vainglorious Patton was, that must have really bothered him, that the most famous war correspondent never wrote a word about him. Now, Ernie,
and that's very modern. It's like not giving the conspiracy theorist airtime. Not giving the bad person the craving, the attention they crave. That would have riled with Patton. Why am I not in this column again?
And then on top of that, he wrote a series of columns about what a great general Bradley was, and Bradley and Patton,
twisting the knife, that is.
Yes, and he said that Bradley was the GI's general. That's where that frame comes from. Is Ernie describing him that way? So I think he found ways to make things known to people who could read between the lines.
That's a streetwise aspect, isn't it? And again, and that you can imagine it, because we said earlier, he's not there to get the scoop. He's not there to make commanders look bad. He's not there to, reveal the big conspiracy going on at HQ. He's just there to tell it like it is. And I can completely imagine someone like Bradley, welcoming that kind of approach to things. He just wants to say what he saw. And that's it. Very simple. And we'll do a couple more questions now, because Lisa Loftus is a massive fan of Ernie Pyle. She says, "I wonder how therapeutic Ernie's writing was for him. So let's say he doesn't go back to war and he stays with Jerry. Would he have carried on writing anyway, because he just couldn't? That you get yourself to a point. If you're doing 6 columns a week or something, not doing it would be really weird, wouldn't it?"
Yeah, he complained a lot about how much he had to write, and he also took kind of a perverse pleasure in how much he had to write. So it was one of those things where he was kind of always saying, "Oh, I've got these 10 columns I have to write, and I have to do this 5,000 word piece for Life, and I have to write this 500 word piece for so and so, and how am I ever going to do it?" And that was kind of his way of doing it, but he kept a deadline, 6 columns a week for 10, 12 years when you add it all up. There are some letters that he wrote towards the end of the war back home to Jerry, where he said after the war ended, he never wanted to write another word, and that he just wanted to buy a chunk of land and kind of escape into the wilderness and not have to deal with all the fame and the attention that he had garnered from his work as a correspondent. I feel like he would have been the kind of writer who would have had a really incredible, autobiography in him to write later in life that really kind of put his life together. I think he would have likely done some drifting around the country to interview veterans or go to veterans hospitals or to, see how wounded vets were getting on with their lives. Like I could see him doing that kind of column writing. I don't know that he would have stayed working as a full-time journalist. I think he might have been able to afford not to, and he would have been burned out enough to, at least take a few years off. But these are all my speculations, right? There wasn't any evidence that I found of him saying that writing was therapeutic, but I have to believe that it was for him in lots of ways, just in the simple act of being able to kind of wrap your arms around something that you experience that's really chaotic and difficult to understand. Just being able to write that down into 1,000 words, helps you process the emotions, helps you process the memory. We know that, those are very beneficial things to do when you experience a traumatic, experience. So I have to believe that he found some therapeutic benefit to it. But who knows, when you weigh both sides of it, the therapeutic benefit, but also all the pressure and the attention that he was receiving, it's one of those, I think it's one of those things where, especially in journalism, there's this joke about how you get so good at the thing that you do that you get promoted into the thing that you're not good at. Like the best reporters become editors, but they're not always the best editors because they were really good reporters. And I think that's how Ernie really was he was a really, really good reporter. And I don't know that he wanted to do anything else. So hard to say, but I like to believe that it was beneficial for him.
No, definitely. And I'm as you're talking about his post-war career, that I wonder whether he'd have made any kind of turn, anti-military, like, again, Bill Mauldin kind of went that way a bit when Vietnam came around and kind of not turned, he never became a full-on, anti-war person, but he definitely, raised questions. But again, he was 20 years younger than Pyle. And again, Pyle being streetwise, older, and he traveled the world. I don't know. That's, I don't want to speculate on what he may or might have done. But one of the questions I want to bring up from, is about, he said, was it more accepted during his writing time to be so open? If so, did the post-war narrative change attitudes to showing vulnerability? Because I think what we're getting to there is there was that weird window of about a year and a half towards the end of World War II where it was okay to open up. I'm thinking about movies like Best Years of Our Lives and A Walk in the Sun, and and even the story of G.I. Joe as well, where there was a it started moving towards opening up, that men are struggling in combat and that returning to civilian life was difficult and not always easy. And then suddenly, like after Best Years of Our Lives came out, I think it won 3 or 4 Oscars, though, it went back to the Halls of Montezuma kind of rah flag waving thing. So do you detect in his writing, obviously he stops writing when he was killed in Okinawa, but was the writing world changing rapidly in that late period of the war?
Well, I don't know that it was changing so rapidly. I think, he was sort of what we would call like a new journalist, or even a gonzo journalist, in the 60s and 70s, where you're not just reporting what you see, but you're kind of inserting yourself as a character in the story, and you're part of the narrative, and the narrative is happening to you, and you are experiencing things, and that gives you the ability to report on thoughts and feelings that you might not have access to if you were just watching, right? And maybe not knowing what people were going through unless you asked them. And so I think there's enough evidence to show that sort of way of telling stories was starting, and that was becoming more acceptable. And then by the 60s, you have, Gay Talese and Hunter S. Thompson and Thomas Wolfe and all these different people that are doing that, routinely, and are writing books and writing magazine articles and are telling a story very, very much from that I perspective. In terms of him being vulnerable, I don't know that he did it purposefully. I think he just wrote what came to him, and he was always trying to be an open book about the thoughts and the feelings and the experiences and how people were trying to understand what was happening. And so, maybe it's just one of those moments where readers are ready and Ernie's the right guy to do it, and there just was this, you know, match made in heaven, because it could have gone the opposite way, right? I mean, people could have read an article that he wrote about, you know, trench foot and say, oh, I don't want to read that. Well, you know, that's I want to know who won the battle, right? Like that could have been the response as well, but it wasn't. You know, the response was, oh, I didn't know that. I never heard of trench foot. What is that? Does my son have that? You know, all of a sudden these questions that make the reader more curious and make them want to know more and make them want to better understand. I think that was the result of Ernie kind of breaking down that wall between the reporter and the subject that they're reporting on.
I think the commitment he made to these 6 columns a week is, you're not going to have enough exciting front page stuff to fill up 6 columns a week, because
very true.
You know, we can look at like the North African campaign and say, well, there was this major advance in February, then there was this major advance in April. And when you say it like that, it sounds like there was no gap between it. If you're sitting as a correspondent, I know he was never sitting as a correspondent in Cairo, but I'm using it as an analogy. You're sitting there, you've got 2 or 3 weeks where there is no news of anything exciting happening at the front, because there's a build-up happening. There's armies are moving hundreds of miles, set up somewhere else. The same in the Pacific, you know, between some of the island hopping campaigns, there's weeks. And in Italy, the same thing. You know, there's an advance, then not very much happens. I mean, lots are happening for the GIs and the Tommies and the Gurkhas and the New Zealanders at the front, but not that's kind of headline for the public back home. And I think that commitment he made to doing a column is, you're going to end up having to write about the mundane stuff. You're going to have to just write about, you know, the how these GIs wrote their letters home and what it was like trying to get, you know, like with Willie and Joe the cartoons, what it was like trying to, you know, get your socks clean when you're fighting up a hill in Italy. And I think that made, for me, his writing so good is that you have all the downtime recorded as well as excitement.
Right. And that's like part of building that trust with the reader, right? Like if you can paint this mosaic of what the experience is like, and then when you have to say, hey, this is when something didn't go well, or here's this time where we fought tooth and nail and it didn't go the way we wanted it to, right? Those really difficult truths, you're more responsive to a guy like Ernie because you trust him, right? When you need to hear a difficult truth, you don't go to someone who disrespects you or someone who talks down to you or someone who doesn't think you're smart enough to understand, right? You go to somebody who says, hey, take a seat, let me explain this, right? And that was Ernie.
Yeah, the long view of a story doesn't have to, like a multi-part TV show these days, where you can have an episode that doesn't seem to be going anywhere, but you realize 5 episodes later on there were lots of things that have been called back to that kind of thing. But,
I hadn't thought about it like that, but that's a good way to think about it.
But we got some pretty good questions coming in there again. So so the first one is a fairly simple one from Kevin Getz. Hi Kevin, we haven't mentioned horse gliders yet. Kevin is a massive horse glider fan, but he says, how much did Ernie's Midwestern upbringing play a role in his ability to tell the story of the common soldier?
I think it had to have been huge. I mean, so he was born in Indiana on a farm. He never wanted to be a farmer. He said that if he had to stare at the back end of a horse for the rest of his life, he didn't think that was much of a life. But I think that ability to really listen, to be okay with boredom, to be able to really sit with people. He had lots of practice as a kid. And then, you know, once he got old enough to go to, I mean, after high school, he enlisted in the Navy right at the end of World War I, and the war ended before he saw any action, and they actually discharged him before he really had done anything. But he had traveled with his college baseball team to Japan. He was lots of wanderlust, lots of adventure in him. And I wonder sometimes if he would have been like that had he been born in New York City or Washington, D.C. or Los Angeles, or, you know, someplace where there were other things to do, right? He grew up in a place where there wasn't anything to do, and all he wanted was to escape and to see the world, and to see that it was it was more than just, cornfields in Indiana. But when I finished graduate school, I was hired for a job in Washington, D.C. And I remember the person who interviewed me in the first kind of level of interviews had said, "Well, I see you're from the Midwest." And I said, "Yes." And they said, "So that means you're hardworking and you're honest." and I said, "Hey, if that's what you want to believe about Midwesterners, I'll take it." But I think there is something to that of doing the hard work, hitting the beat, going until you get the story, not quitting, being able to live in uncomfortable situations, all those things. I think you could tie back to his childhood.
No, definitely. So a kind of simple question that will actually explain things for those who don't understand, and perhaps we should have mentioned it earlier. So Sean Brennan is saying, who did Ernie Pyle actually work for? His column was syndicated in countless newspapers, but who did he submit them to and had to take direction from?
So he worked for the Scripps Howard newspaper syndicate, and they had their flagship newspaper was in Washington, D.C., but they owned dozens of newspapers. And so Ernie's editor, his name was Lee Miller. He was based in Washington, D.C. And so everything that Ernie sent, he sent to Lee Miller. Lee Miller would do the editing, and then they would distribute his column to all of the different newspapers that syndicated it. And I don't have the numbers memorized off the top of my head, but it was hundreds of newspapers at the height of his fame. And every single time a newspaper syndicated his column, Ernie got a chunk of that money. Scripps Howard's got a chunk of that money. So the hundreds of newspapers, added up to pretty big royalties for Ernie. This was at a time when the tax rate was quite high for people in the top earning brackets. So he ended up spending a lot of money buying war bonds and donating money because he was in such a high tax bracket for a long time. But the interesting thing about, if you go back to try to study Ernie's columns, you really have to just pick one newspaper and focus on that, because each newspaper could kind of cut and paste Ernie's column into the space that they had available at the paper. So some papers would keep, the first 400 words, and other papers would print the whole thing, and other papers would publish Ernie's column and then a column complementing it. Like there were all these kind of different ways that it was presented. And so depending on what newspaper you read him in, you may have gotten his column every day. You may have gotten it just once a week. You may have gotten it, pooled together. So they might have taken 3 or 4 columns and put them into one long piece. So that's kind of an interesting dilemma I ran into when I started doing the research. Was depending on what newspaper depends on what it actually looks like when it's published.
Fascinating. And again, obviously, they must have had a huge amount of trust in him, the editors,
Yes.
because again, he was streetwise. He'd been around the block. This again, we were referencing this sort of 30-year overnight sensation that he was, but respected and trusted, and the public loved him, and all of that entails. And we'll talk about, you talked about the fame he had and how he was dealing with that, and the dying at the height of your fame is the classic kind of the Glenn Miller, the James Dean thing. We can talk about that in a minute.
Yep.
But a couple of the first couple, 2 more questions, then we'll go back to you. So this is a really fascinating one from James Murphy. Of the war correspondents I know, some are subconsciously suicidal. Would you diagnose Ernie likewise somehow? That's that thing. Why are people drawn to the war zones that don't have to be there?
Yeah, I think especially at the end, there's some evidence of that. So when Ernie landed on April 1st in Okinawa, he said that was going to be his last invasion, that he would never do another, landing on a beach. And then 17 days later, he did another landing on a tiny island off the coast of Okinawa, and that's where he ended up being killed. And so if you follow, his letters, he should have never been there. I didn't find any good evidence of why he ultimately changed his mind, but I think the best explanation came from another correspondent named Robert Sherrod, who knew Ernie and was at the Battle of Okinawa as well. And he said that a soldier must have asked Ernie to come along because Ernie never said no to a soldier. And so I think that that's probably what ended up happening. But the reason why I speculate he might have been, to a certain degree suicidal, or at least didn't care any longer, whether he made it through, was when he landed on that little island, he was wearing a tan officer's uniform. And all the other soldiers were like, "You can't wear that. You will attract a sniper. You have to wear this jungle green coat." So they gave him this coat. Well, then we have the picture of what Ernie's dressed in after he was killed, and he's wearing the tan uniform again. He was also wearing aviator sunglasses and a kind of an officer's looking cap, and he was in his mid-40s. So if you're a Japanese sniper, right, and you see a guy in his mid-40s with aviator glasses and an officer's hat that's wearing a tan uniform, you probably think, "Oh, there's an important." That's a general. That's an important guy. I'm going to take him out. That's fascinating.
Yeah.
So he knew better than that, right? He knew a lot better than that. And it does make you question whether, like I said, whether he was suicidal or whether he just didn't care anymore as much as he used to.
Or, of course, he could just be absolutely, as we say in England, knackered. That's that.
Or that too.
Yeah. A lot that, no matter how good the combat soldier is, and he is effectively a combat soldier in the sense he's in the combat zones, he's just not actually firing a bloody rifle. But after 90 days or something, they would say, people, you just don't perform as well. We've talked about it numerous times, this channel of really experienced air crews or really experienced leaders. They've been at it for so long, they just start making mistakes. They start letting their standards drop. They're not doing it deliberately or consciously. It's just fatigue. It's just stress. It's the entry level of what at the other end people are suffering from complete neuroses and problems and more. But the first step is kind of not looking after yourself. We had Mary Louise Roberts on talking about sheer misery about a year ago. That winter of 44, 45 in the ETO and towards the end of the Pacific campaign, everyone is they're running on empty.
Yeah, that's a good point.
And it could be a combination of all those things. And so a subconscious, don't care anymore. You're just not thinking anymore. People are giving you advice, and it's going in one ear and coming out the other. Rommel in Normandy advised, don't go in a staff car on your journey there. The Allies are marauding with fighters in a staff car. What does he do? Goes in a staff car, gets himself shot up. It's a rookie mistake. So,
that's a really good point.
But thank you. We've got some more questions there. So Susan Yu is saying, who is a brigadier on World War II TV. She's my top sponsor of the channel. So we need another brigadier or two. So Susan, thank you very much. So the question for David, how does Ernie's reporting compare to today's war correspondence? So you're in a position to understand the art of writing, and it's obviously changed over the decades. So what's your response to how does he compare?
Well, I like to say that there aren't any Ernie Pyles today, but there also weren't any, Seymour Hirsches during World War II, or, the Michael Hers, or, the sort of like investigative reporters. That was not a thing during World War II. The censors would never have allowed it. The military wouldn't have allowed it. Ernie was basically a quasi staff officer, right? He wore a uniform. He relied on the military for everything: security, food, shelter, you name it. He was there to help win the war. And I think that mindset is very different now, right? So you might have a reporter that, is sympathetic to the American cause or to the Allied cause or whatever it is, but they're also there, trying to uncover things or trying to investigate things or trying to, tell the truth about something that happened that gets misreported, right? Ernie was never really in that business. He wasn't an investigative reporter. During the Vietnam era, there are a few kind of thought leaders in journalism who look back on the reporting that Ernie did, and they call him a cheerleader or a propagandist, or they say, he wasn't doing real reporting. And every war correspondent that I have ever told that to has stopped me and corrected me and basically said something to the effect of, Ernie wasn't a cheerleader for the war. He was a cheerleader for the soldiers.
Yeah.
And that is different. and they said that they still see that as part of their job, that they're there to tell the stories that we would be proud of, or tell the stories of successes, or tell the stories of, things that went well, but also they're not restricted from writing about the things that don't go well, or writing about the ways in which we don't live up to our values or our standards, or whatever it is. And again, that was just not something Ernie did overtly. But that being said, I think there are people that do reporting that reminds me of the kind of reporting that Ernie did. So one of my favorites is a journalist named David Wood. And he was awarded the Pulitzer Prize for a series that he did on soldiers who were experiencing what he called moral injury. So soldiers that are asked to do things that contradict their values or their morals, or they participate in things that contradict that, and what that does to you psychologically, basically, destroying whatever value system you had developed over the course of your life. And he had to embed himself with troops. He was living with them. He went home with them. He, wrote about the really intimate, specific details of their lives. And when I talked to him, when I was researching my book, he actually said to me, "Oh, I became a journalist because of Ernie Pyle." And so I think his influence is undeniable, and people try to emulate them as much as they can, but within keeping with, the way the profession has changed as well.
To me, it's some kind of integrity and clarity about. There's nothing wrong with a journalist favoring their own career,
Right.
wanting to be more successful, wanting to do and if that means uncovering something for themselves for their career, that's fine, as long as that's why people know you're there, kind of thing. Right. I'm here to make a name for myself. There's also nothing wrong with investigative journalism. I mean, that's how things like Watergate were broken, by people doing the hours and trying to find out what was going on. But as you say there, Pyle just seems to make the decision to just want to report what the soldiers, the airmen, the sailors, the civilians were experiencing. And if he had suddenly, even if he'd found some scoop, even if he'd found out that there's some conspiracy about a general or something, if he had broken that in 44, 45, he probably would have ruined all the reputation. He said, how can you do that? You were not there for this. You were there to tell us what it was like on the battlefields. I think that streetwise aspect, I think even if he found a scoop, he'd have passed it on to someone else, I'm guessing.
I think that's what he did with Patton, right? I mean, Drew Pearson was the journalist that broke that story and of Patton slapping the soldiers. And the main reason he was able to do that was because he was based in the United States and wasn't subjected to the military censorship. And so he heard the story through someone who had been there, and he reported it in a column called Merry-Go-Round, which was basically like a tabloid column for Washington, D.C. So I think he would have been accused of being a tabloid reporter, essentially, if he had done something like that.
Okay, thanks. So my last question is going to be kind of maybe a tough one for you. And this is me with my historian's hat on, is that, we're often talking about sources. So we have war diaries, we have after action reports, we have the documentation at the time, we have memoirs of those who were there. And the constant battle is to determine the truth of history, the truth of what happened here. So when you have someone who is a journalist, which Ernie Pyle was, how valuable is his record of the war in terms of understanding how the war was fought? Because you said yourself with your book, you were there to look into how did he write about the Italian campaign? Did he get into the Italian campaign wrong? For the people who are watching this, who are unashamed amateur historians of World War II, what can they learn from Ernie Pyle's writings?
Well, the way I see other historians use Ernie Pyle's material, and I mean, good luck finding a history of World War II that doesn't quote Ernie Pyle in it. But the ways in which his material gets used in general histories is always when the writer wants to sort of zoom in on something. So, when you're going to tell the story of, the Italian campaign, and you're going to talk about the slog that the soldiers were going through, and you're going to talk about how Mark Clark didn't seem to understand how to fight through the Leary Valley, and frontally assaulting every mountain was incredibly costly, and what about Anzio, right? And we can have all these debates, and then it's like, oh, but also Captain Wascow was killed in the Battle of San Pietro, and here was the real cost of the fighting was men like Captain Wascow, right? And so like anytime the historian or the writer wants to really zoom in on something and make a point that's going to like really hang on your emotions, they quote Ernie Pyle. And I feel like if that's what you're looking for, if you're looking for granular detail, if you're looking for a zoomed in perspective, if you're looking to try to understand what someone was feeling or what they were going through mentally while they were experiencing something, that's where you turn to Ernie Pyle. When I was writing the book, the research I really had to do was, but wait, how many planes were there? How many boats were? Because that's just nowhere in Ernie's reporting. He doesn't really care about that high level. And so that was kind of a fun mission for me, was weaving together, the things that he was seeing on the kind of worm's eye view, right, that he called the worm's eye view, and then comparing that to the bird's eye view and seeing, where there were disconnects. And I didn't find very many, to be honest. There are a few in the early years, but as he becomes, I think I like how you phrase it, as he becomes more street smart in his war correspondence, he doesn't make those same mistakes later on.
I mean, to sum things up, I think I'm going to go off on a typical World War II TV rabbit hole, but I was discussing with the historian David O'Keefe the Thin Red Line movie, the 90s version, and he loves it and I don't like it. And one of the things I don't like about it is none of the dialogue of the narration seems like what a young men at war actually said. I mean, one of the things as a historian myself is you get a bundle of letters that have never been read by some soldiers in the Italian camp, and you think there's going to be gold dust in there, and you read it, and it's usually just, no offense to these soldiers, rubbish. How are you, Mum? How's the dog? I did get your parcel of baked beans. You're hoping you're going to find something like Ernie Pyle in there, like Farley Moat, the Canadian, and you don't. And I think that's what Ernie Pyle did. He was able to put the views of thousands of GIs and Marines and airmen who were thinking what Ernie was thinking, but would never have been able to convey it in the way that he did, because they didn't have the time to write it down, because they're fighting a bloody war and they're cold and they're hungry, and they just didn't have that ability as he was in 45 years old to put that years of being out there, as you said at the beginning of this. He knew how to write. He'd done his apprenticeship on the streets in the Depression. He knew how to write. He knew how to get the emotional hub of something using very simple, plain language. That's what I love about his Omaha stuff. As I told you before going online, some of Ernest Hemingway's stuff about the Normandy campaign is so, he obviously had the thesaurus open all the time, trying to find a big flowery word to shove in there so that you remember the public's reading. And what the hell is that word? Pyle doesn't use big words. Pyle doesn't put anything in there that, here's my word. It's one of those calendars with a word of the day to try and get anti-disestablishmentarianism into his sentence or something. So, Pyle was able to just convey what people there were thinking but didn't know how to articulate.
I think that's exactly right.
Yeah, and I'm thinking the British equivalent is Spike Milligan, who you may not be familiar, but he was a comedian in the 50s and 60s, but he just wrote his memoirs as a war comedy, but it tells so much about what it was like to fight in North Africa and Tunisia. And the fact now historians, Peter Gaddick Adams, is turning to Spike Milligan, basically a kind of a comedy poet author, to get the experiences of what it was like to be in the British Army in Tunisia campaign. It's extraordinary that people like Spike Milligan, who wasn't even trying to do that, but Ernie Pyle was trying to do it. But to round things up, I mean, obviously the book is doing very well. You said that it's going to appeal to people who want to understand who this guy was who's writing about the war. Anything else you want to kind of say about Ernie Pyle that you think we've missed in this chat so far?
Well, we've covered so much. I would say the one thing that I always kind of come back to, the thought I always come back to, is that it's exactly, you mentioned it earlier about there's this real tension for him between his duty at home and his duty overseas. And in the beginning, I think it was easy to see that the war really, or that Ernie really needed the war. He needed that escape. He needed that challenge. He needed that purpose. And then as the war progressed, he started to need it less and less. And he really wanted to be at home, but the war needed him more and more. And by the end, the war, I think, needed him more than Ernie needed it. And that was what really fascinated me about him, was how did he navigate that? Part of me, as a husband and father myself, I look at it and I think, okay, how do I not make that same mistake, right? How do I make sure that I take care of my family and go do my work? Or when I think about, I'm approaching Ernie's age when he became a correspondent. Is that something I would do if the war suddenly expanded and America, the book is almost like a computer simulation. You get to kind of play out like, what would I have done in that situation, and how would I have felt, and would I have felt that same level of duty, or would I have done this instead? And so I think even if obviously folks in this watching this are already interested in World War II, but even if you're not interested in World War II, I think Ernie's story is just a really great human story.
No, definitely. I mean, again, we could go down another discussion there, but that I think he simplifies for a lot of people the complication of the guy who is the first over the line to volunteer when the war, whether they're American, British, who goes off with gusto, who wants to defeat the enemy, wants to serve their country, wants to right the wrongs of the world, but then 4 years later, is now trapped by that kind of that feeling of, but why did I do this? But you can't. But the war needs you. You're now in a position where people are depending on you. You've risen up through the ranks, which he effectively has, even though he's not leading men. He's now influencing other people. There are, as you said, there are 12.5 million people every day waiting to see what he's writing about the war. So he can't just pull out. He can't pull out now. Just like your field marshals can't pull away. They may be hating it. They may be weary. They may be cynical about it now, but you can't just suddenly go, okay, well, that's it now, I'm going to go home. I wish I hadn't done it now. And I think for me, that's Ernie Pyle's journey, and what you're able to convey there is it's a lot of people's journey, but he was able to communicate even in a sort of this tangent way where he wasn't necessarily exactly confronting the issues, but he was using his street savvy to kind of convey what that journey was like.
Yeah, well said.
Brilliant. Well, we'll leave it there, David. It's been absolutely great talking to you. People are saying, bring him back for more, bring him back for more. So we'll
Thank
do
you
that.
very much.
We could analyze perhaps in the future some of Ernie's particular reports, or
I would love
that we could do that. This is a bit of part one, I think we'll call it. But folks, we'll leave it there. Thanks for your insightful questions, everybody. Thank you for the interaction, David. Good luck with everything. The links to David's book are in the description below, as there is a link to his website, so you can find out more about David and his works and Ernie Pyle. But see you all again tomorrow when we talk about the rather, as I said earlier, disturbing subject but important subject of suicide in the military. So that's with Mark Turner. So see you all tomorrow. Thanks everybody for watching. This is Paul Woodad for World War II TV saying enjoy the rest of your day. Cheers, everybody. Bye.
Thank you.